Well, I know that in this audience we have lawyers and political scientists and zoologists and philosophers and moral thinkers. So this is a perfect audience to pick up that. Somebody.
Do you mind if we go woman, man, and if anybody identifies as non-binary,
man,
can
woman,
raise their
man,
hand
woman. Okay.
at any time? Oh, all right, well, we'll start with you, then we go to a woman. No,
Okay.
no,
You happen to be a man, I think.
Hi, George. I like the talk. I agree with a lot of what you said. I'm none of those professions. I'm just a master's student here doing conservation. And we've had a big focus on environmental economics in our course. I've found that I've been quite against a lot of it. My question for you is, could you see a world in which the forces that I would say brought us to the situation we're in can be used to solve their own problems, as in consumerism, which I would link to capitalism?
Thank you. Well, I think this is another crucial question. And as has certainly been attributed to Einstein, probably misattributed, most of these quotes are, you cannot solve a problem with the thinking that got you into it. And constantly we're trying to solve this problem with the thinking that got us into it. Green consumerism, green growth. Green growth is as much as an oxymoron as clean coal. It's preposterous. It's another of our preposterous assumptions. So Jason Hickel's done some very interesting work on this. And broadly speaking, 15 billion tons of material flow a year is roughly a level that the world systems can sustain without breaching planetary boundaries. At the moment, is roughly 70 billion tons is what we're using. So as a result, we're breaching several of the critical planetary boundaries, putting Earth systems under massive strain. Now, most of the world's governments and global bodies want growth to continue. In fact, they all do. And they talk about growth rates. They talk airily of 3% growth. That's a reasonable rate of growth. Well, that means a doubling in economic activity every 24 years. And you say, right, so we're already breaching the planetary boundaries as a result of our economic activity. And now you want to double that activity. How's that going to work? Oh, and by the way, then it doubles again and after another 24 years. So we have 4 times as much in 48 years. Now already, material resource use has increased 3-fold in 40 years. So we're going to have that 12-fold increase in the next 40 years? It's extraordinary. Just an amazing thing. They say, oh no, don't worry, we can decouple. We can decouple economic growth from material resource use. No trouble at all. So Jason ran the numbers and just looked at various things such as limits to efficiency. The Carnot limit, for instance, Carnot efficiency. I mean, there's all sorts of inherent thermodynamic limits to efficiency, which economists don't do thermodynamics, they'd much rather assume that it doesn't exist. And in fact, in most of their assumptions, it doesn't exist. It's fine, okay, we can just dispense with the physical world. And he looked at the limits to absolute decoupling, which has never happened anywhere on Earth, and the limits to relative decoupling, which means less resource use per unit of economic activity rather than less resource use altogether. And he found that current rates of growth without intervention, by 2050 we get to around 180 billion tons of resource use. Remembering the sustainable level is roughly 50 billion, we're currently at 70 billion. With some incredibly optimistic assumptions, a very high carbon price, and completely ignoring the Jevons paradox, the rebound effect, you could possibly, at current rates of growth, limit that to 90 billion tons a year. That's still almost double the sustainable level. But then you have to take into account the rebound effect, which says that the more efficient use of any particular resource leads to an increased use of that resource, because it becomes cheaper to use that resource than it does competing resources, and so money flows into the use of that resource. And if you take into account the rebound effect, you get up to about 130 billion tons, which is almost twice our current use of resources. So you just can't do it. So all this stuff about green consumerism and green growth is, to use the term understood by both scientists and economists, bollocks.
Right, under the Monbiot rules, we need a female, somebody, yeah, here we are, right.
Yes, so thank you very much for your talk. So you set out the issue as a unified, in a sense, problem that, in a sense, also requires a uniform solution. And I think we need to be careful in that regard, because the allotment issue, that is one that works, because you would share your allotment with people from the same neighborhood or from the same area of town. You would possibly know each other. There's also the social pressure and the kind of uncodified kind of behavioral codex that also works and kind of nudges behavior in a specific way. And that doesn't necessarily work at a global scale. So I think when we're kind of reflecting on the possible solutions and ways ahead, that we also need to consider both legal culture, that something works in certain countries or contexts, but not in others, and just the plurality of regulatory kind of responses. And that they don't need to be of regulatory nature, but the different responses that are required here.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I'm absolutely not saying this is the one and only solution. I think that the commons is part of the solution. It's massively neglected. It's got an awful lot to teach us, both practically and sort of theoretically and metaphorically. It's been massively maligned and misunderstood. The classic formulation is the tragedy of the commons. Garrett Hardin's famous paper in 1968, published in Science, by a game theorist, a biologist, who clearly had never come across a commons in reality and didn't even understand the theoretical basis of a commons. What he was describing was an open access regime, a bit like the oceans are today, oceanic fisheries. Beyond national territorial limits, anyone can have a go and just grab as many fish as they want, with catastrophic results. He was assuming that applies in a commons, which is involves, as I say, a resource controlled by a particular community. Now, he used the example of a herder who's putting an animal onto a common pasture, and the herder receives 100% of the value of that animal, but the cost imposed by that extra animal is shared by the community as a whole. Now, it just happened that I read The Tragedy of the Commons when I was working in northwestern Kenya with the Turkana people, who were herders, pastoralists, on common land. If someone grazed their animals without permission on your clan's land, or added more animals to their flock than they were entitled to do, they would be driven away with sticks. They did it twice, they'd be tied to a tree and beaten with sticks. They did it 3 times, they'd be tied to a tree and beaten to death with sticks. Harsh, but no one could deny that regulation was occurring. Now, this utterly preposterous notion became another preposterous, so basically what I discover as I go on through life is that just about everything we believe to be true, everything that is common knowledge within the media, within public discourse, within popular understanding is complete rubbish. And The Tragedy of the Commons is another one of those. This was adopted massively, picked up because lots of people wanted to privatize or nationalize commons. So both governments and neoliberals wanted commons for themselves. It was a massive resource grab, and The Tragedy of the Commons gave them that opportunity. So it's a hugely misunderstood sector. It's a hugely underexplored sector, despite the wonderful work by Elinor Ostrom and others. And it's got tremendous potential for further exploration and examination, because while I accept what you say about different legal norms and things around the world, one thing is quite remarkable, that commons have been independently generated around the world in almost identical forms. It's quite remarkable. I mean, in the Americas, in Siberia, in Africa, in Asia, in Europe, we see commons following very similar trajectories because there is a sort of social and economic logic to them. This is how we rub along. This is how we are able to manage natural wealth without killing each other. We do so by creating a commons. So I think there is a sort of common touchstone here that we can draw on and apply. But exactly how we do that, especially when we're looking at huge global resources, well, there's a lot of work still to be done. And obviously, you can't just do it through spontaneous negotiation. There had to be legal frameworks and all the rest of it. But I believe it gives us some broad guidelines to which we can begin to work.
David.
George, I wonder if I could dare to nudge you just a little bit further down your radical road.
Please.
That you were talking about two very closely related, entwined things. And one of them was about the way people have acquired and then retained territory. But another, perhaps even more perplexing, was about the amount of available territory and how it can reasonably be partitioned. So on that second part, the nudge I would like to make to you is that if there is a cake and there's only so many slices of it available, and at the moment it's not sliced in a sustainable or even rational way, that's a big problem because there's so many people to be considered. How do you react to the thought that the family of concern spreads beyond people to biodiversity and the wider environment, meaning that the slicing of that cake is even more challenging? And I think it's a question about what I think an ethicist would call intrinsic value. People have it. I don't think anybody's going to argue with that. People who have it require our concern. My position is that there are other animals that have intrinsic value and also need to be concerned, a cause of concern when we do that slicing up. So I think the problem is even bigger and requires an even more radical solution than you were conservatively hinting at.
Yes, well, yes, I'm often accused of conservatism. Thank you, David. No, well, look, I completely agree. Except I would say not just animals, obviously, all life forms. And you know, we have intergenerational theft and interspecific theft as well. And we arrogate to ourselves these huge proportion of the living world, whereas we, instead of sharing it with the many millions of other species that live here. Now, I very much support the aims of the Nature Needs Half campaign. It's not very generous, considering we're one species and they're millions. Well, we'll let them have half, but at least it's a start. Of course, we're a very long way from that. You know, if you look at British marine reserves, I mean, the actual proper marine, not the paper parks, which just are lines on a map, but the actual places where fishing is not allowed, where we have 48,000 square kilometres of territorial waters in this country. 5 of them are set aside for nature, 5 square kilometres. So that's nature gets 0.001%, if I got that right. Or, anyway, give or take a 0. Yeah, not very much. And it's you know, we are shockingly ungenerous towards the rest of the living world. And you're absolutely right. We have to, I mean, even for instrumental reasons, we should be giving nature at least half. Not least because we now discover, fascinatingly, and I've been doing a bit of work on this, and it's a really quite exciting field, that really the only way we're going to avoid climate breakdown is through allowing ecosystems to recover and drawing down carbon from the atmosphere. We've now left it so late that even if we cut all industrial emissions, transport emissions, domestic emissions tomorrow, we're almost certainly going to breach 1.5 degrees of global heating. That seems to be pretty well the scientific consensus now. So we need carbon drawdown alongside that. And there are all sorts of crazy exotic schemes like bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, which, you know, in one scenario means planting up an area 3 times the size of India with plantations, burning the wood in power stations and burying the carbon dioxide in geological formations, which leads either to mass starvation or to mass environmental destruction or both. It's insane. But there are plenty of highly intelligent academics who think it's a great idea. Or the direct air capture with massive machines, which it probably requires so much carbon-heavy infrastructure that it pushes us past the tipping point into disaster anyway. So, but there is this much better way of doing it, which is allow ecosystems to recover and they draw down carbon. So forests are basically wet carbon They draw it out of the air, they turn it into wood. Peat is a fantastic accumulator of carbon, salt marshes, mangroves. If we stop trawling and dredging, they are constantly mobilizing the carbon in the seabed, kicking it up into the water column where it oxidizes into carbon dioxide. You leave it be, you've got a huge carbon store. So there's self-interest here as well as the interests of other species. You're absolutely right. It complicates it further. We have to take into account our theft of natural wealth from all the other species on Earth as well. But perhaps there's not so much conflict between those aims as we might initially assume.
So Charlie. Hi.
Thank you so much for this talk. So just building on what you talked about supporting nature needs half and transferring wealth from private hands to commons. How do you see that in light of debates about viewing ourselves as a separation from nature versus what are ideas of wilderness and what ideas of nature we're trying to restore the earth to, and how you sort of add to popular narratives about what ideas we're trying to restore to and connect people to nature with.
Thank you.
How do you see that?
Thanks. Well, another crucial issue. And this issue immediately asks us to consider baselines. There's this wonderful concept formulated by the fisheries scientist Daniel Pauly called shifting baseline syndrome. And that says that we conceive as natural and normal the situation that prevailed in our youth. And so we look at ecosystems as they were in our youth and say, that's how they ought to be. We need to get back to that, and then everything will be fine. Forgetting that what we were used to was a state of extreme depletion that our parents or grandparents would have seen as an appalling situation. And they would have thought the right situation is what prevailed in my youth. And so it goes on. And so we forget. It's this societal forgetting. And we forget, for instance, that in Britain, ours is an elephant-adapted ecosystem. You walk outside, you see the deciduous trees here. Why do they coppice? Why do they hedge? Why are the small understory trees much stronger than the big overstory trees? It's because they evolved to resist the straight-tusked elephant. Elephas anticus, or Paleoopsilon anticus, as I think it is now, this vast creature which made the African elephant look like a ballet dancer. There should be elephants here. But so far there hasn't been much clamour for their reintroduction. I don't know why, but and there should be lions, and there should be hippos, and there should be rhinos. I mean, I'm saying should. There were before we came and trashed them all. So it's going to be a constant negotiation. What baseline do we go to? Incidentally, Daniel Pauly has also come up with this concept, shifting waistline syndrome. He points out that a medium-sized jumper today is about 3 sizes bigger than it was 40 years ago. But it's medium. It's fine. We forget that what's medium today is large before. It applies in politics as well. You become used to all sorts of outrageous situations, and that's a real massive human failing. So there's this constant negotiation about what is a healthy relationship between human beings and the rest of the living world. And I think the starting point is that rest of the living world. It's that recognition that we are one of many species. We don't have inherent and intrinsic rights that are greater than those of other species. But somehow, because we are so much better at projecting our rights than other species are, we have to interpret our position and balance our demands against the needs of other species to exist. And there's no easy answer. There are no clear dividing lines at all. As an ecologist, I'd say as much as we can possibly get away with. And that's the sort of rewilding principle which I've applied is, the constraints on rewilding are not ecological. You could have wolves perfectly happily living out of dustbins in Oxford. Or maybe not with the new collection system, but in principle, there's plenty of deer in Oxford. Wolves would be perfectly happy here, but the constraints tend to be political. For some reason, people would object to wolves living off the deer and the cats and the dogs of Oxford, and so it's basically as much as you can get away with politically, and so that then depends upon persuasion and debate and discourse and all the other things which are largely forbidden by the UK's media.
I think we have to have a woman at the top, yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
No, we just had a man. What was that last one? Whose turn is it?
Yeah, no, there is a man. It is a man's turn.
It's a man, sorry. It's
We
a
can have
man's
a man.
turn, sorry.
We are allowed a man.
I'm
We're allowed a man.
lost count.
And incidentally, anyone, if you identify as non-binary, you stick your hand up at any time.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah, thanks. So, in light of the important questions you've raised about the global economy, property, growth, how do we approach this and also consider individuals in low-income countries who perfectly justifiably would like to live the lifestyles we've enjoyed in richer countries?
Well, I mean, the only option is for us to reduce our levels of consumption to fit within planetary boundaries. I mean, we can't say to anybody else, you can't have what we've had unless we are showing that we're actually prepared not to have that anymore. Now, this is a huge challenge, obviously, but we're only going to navigate it and negotiate it by, I think, radically changing our economic system. You know, if we have a system which continues to be based on capital accumulation and competition and self-aggrandizement through capital, and fundamentally the belief that the numbers in your bank account equate to a right to grab natural wealth, then obviously everybody is going to be scrambling over everybody else to get as much of their share as they possibly can. The only way we can possibly resolve this is by having a system based on different principles, and that's why I'm so interested in the commons, because that enables everybody to have wealth, everybody to have their needs met without depriving other people of wealth. Because in a resource-constrained world, which is what we're in, at the moment, any extra increment of natural wealth that accrues to yourself is taken from somebody else. And we have to move to a system where that's no longer the case. Now, you know, as with all these discussions, the more you talk, the more ambitious it becomes, because you begin to recognize the implications of you begin to see just how huge the thing is that you're asking for. But we've got to think big. You know, we're faced with huge existential crises at the moment. We're faced with an emergency, a climate emergency, an ecological emergency, an emergency of equity and distribution, an economic emergency, a political emergency. Because those other emergencies aren't being dealt with, we have these great openings for demagogues and fascists to move into the political space because politics isn't delivering for people. And these are huge issues which require huge responses. And we can't do it anymore just by tinkering, but we have an entire political system dedicated to tinkering, to technocratic managerialism, which just says, oh, maybe we tweak this a little bit, things will be all right. They won't be. They're not going to be all right. Tweaking isn't going to make anything all right anymore. We need huge revolutionary change. And that begins with thinking and talking, deciding. I don't have all the answers yet, but I'm beginning to see just how big the answers have to be.
Question up here.
So on that point, I wonder if the commons is a red herring, and actually it's just tinkering. Because really, it seems to me that what you're highlighting is the virtue of the commons is it makes clear what is the carrying capacity of the earth. But it's only going to work if the people in that community know what the carrying capacity is. So I wonder if really what you're talking about are the laws which protect that carrying capacity. So for example, if you just move to saying, okay, let's have a law about intergenerational theft. Now I'm putting this out in the brainstorming, but I just wonder if tinkering around with the commons is actually a way of avoiding that big question.
Okay, no, that's really interesting. Can you just spell that out a little bit more? What would a law on intergenerational theft look like?
You know, what you're highlighting and striking there is the regulation. Now, I don't know what a law of intergenerational equity would look like. It's difficult to craft. But for example, if we take the Climate Change Act here in 2008, Section 1, makes clear we have a duty to reduce emissions by 80% by 2050. If we take the Victorian Climate Change Act in 2017, that's zero emissions. Now you could start playing around with those types of obligations, and they send very clear messages to the markets. But I could see you could get a lot of angst around commons. So.
Okay, so I think this is very interesting, but I wonder if we're talking about two different things, because obviously we need a framework of law, whatever economic sector we happen to be in. And the Climate Change Act is a very good example, and it's got these great intergenerational qualities. Unfortunately, we now know it doesn't go nearly far enough, but we can put that aside. I mean, the principle of it was very sound. And it came about as a result of some fantastic campaigning, which came about as a result of some fantastic thinking. It's discussions just like this one. And what it says is that within a capitalist system, we are going to set up some laws so that capitalist system doesn't completely deprive other people in future generations of the means of living. Now, you could say, well, there's problems with this because the capitalist system means you're necessarily going to start hitting the limits of efficiency within that time period. It's going to be constantly pushing at any limits you aren't already hitting because of the need for growth and because of the way that innovation cuts both ways. But that doesn't invalidate the legal principle of what you're trying to do there. Now, in a commons, you have exactly the same legal principle because the commons is inalienable. So it's sort of baked in, the legal principle is baked in that because you can't sell this, you can't give it away, you can't liquidate those resources, you are almost inherently obliged to pass them on in the same form to the new commoners who come into the system, who might, include people 50 years hence, 100 years hence, and the rest of it. Now, sometimes this is applied more effectively than at other times. If you look at some of the sheep commons in Cumbria, they're total ecological disaster areas. And part of the problem there is a problem of split incentives, is that land is owned by one person and then there's common rights in it which are held by other people. But partly the whole system has kind of gone wrong and the rules aren't strong enough. So, even within commons, you have to have the right set of rules and the strong enough rules and proper monitoring and enforcement of those rules. And there's always a big question in any commons is the community capable of doing that entirely themselves? Or does there have to be some form of external monitoring and arbitration? Now, what we tend to find is where the community has a completely free hand, it's pretty good at doing it within the limits of its own understanding. But the limits of its understanding might be pretty constrained, as they are in the sheep commons, where you say, oh, isn't this beautiful? Look, it's all green. Yeah, there's nothing else living here except for bloody sheep, but it's green, it's great, that's what we want. And so, obviously, there has to be some sort of external input, if only in the form of better ecological understanding of what's going on. But I would say that what you're suggesting applies equally to any economic system that you might be dealing with, whether it's state ownership, market ownership, household, or commons. You still have to have that intergenerational legal framework at work. And sometimes it's strong enough and sometimes it's not.
Yes.
I'm going to be a bit more radical. I think...
I love this. Everyone's telling me to be more radical. This is brilliant. Come on.
Is the problem. Two or three things occurred to me while you're talking. I think The Guardian reported that 10% of the nation's land passed from public into private ownership in the last 10 years. Yeah. That's shocking. The other thing is we had commons. We had these three-field system and so on. It was the enclosures around in this area around about 1800 that drove them all into private hands. And a little detail there, which I enjoyed, the inalienability of this common land was overruled by Act of Parliament. That's why
that's right.
The enclosures were all driven by Acts of Parliament. My family's all medical, and at a family gathering recently, I said that the real problem, you're all talking about the wrong thing. It's not CO2, it's humans. There are far too many of us. And my brother-in-law said, what are you suggesting? I said, well, let's get rid of the doctors. And he said,
well, that's certainly radical. Does what it says on the tin.
I think they had a point. As much damage as they...
Okay, well, so let's apply that, that starting position of yours to the two examples that you propose, the historical acts of enclosure.
If I may, his first question at the front here was saying, I thought he was saying something quite interesting. Can you use the forces that caused the problem to cure the problem? And I think unless you do that, you won't cure it. The forces are the political forces that drove the enclosures. We haven't solved the problem. It's greed and self-preservation.
Okay.
And if you can find those and see how they solve the problem, you'll get there.
Right. Well, let's take your initial premise that the underlying problem is population growth. I take it you mean, and the size of the global population. And you connect this both to the enclosures in the 18th century through Acts of Parliament and through the informal enclosures taking place today with the privatization of state-owned land, as Christopher Bartels, is it, who just brought out a book on this subject. I haven't read it yet, it looks very interesting. I can't see any connection between those issues at all. I mean, what we saw in the 18th century was a tiny proportion of the population, the lords of the land, kicking everybody else off the land and forcing them either into destitution or into the cities. And now what we see is a tiny proportion of the population pouring money into the Conservative Party, which then sells off the land, which they can then profit from. So nothing to do with the general size of the global population or indeed of its growth rate. And this is what we find in issue after issue. That, for instance, today I was writing about how we need to get rid of the private car pretty well. I'm talking about a 90% reduction in private car use within 10 years, one of my many conservative ideas. And several people in the comment thread, which, I got this sort of sick fascination with the comment thread. You should never read a comment thread, but I can't help it. Every time it's sort of drawn in. What do they think? Several people say, the problem is population. Sorry, how is the problem population? In densely habited parts of the country, like Oxford, you can solve this much more easily than you can in lightly habited parts of the country because you've got enough population to sustain a mass transit system. You might ask, why aren't we using one in Oxford? Why haven't we got one yet? Why don't we have electrified light rail or something like that in Oxford? That's another question. But you can do it here because there's enough people. You can't do it out in the small villages because there's not enough footfall to sustain a system like that. And so people are much more dependent on cars. And what we find again and again is that people, you come up with almost any environmental issue and people say, the real problem is population. And you explore this and you say, well, how is the real problem population? And, it's just it is, there's too many people. And very often, as with this case, you find that the linkage is either extremely weak or non-existent. And I see us as a whole using population as a way of not engaging with our very real impacts. Because what we're doing, unconsciously I'm sure, is transferring blame away from ourselves, who, as phenomenally rich people by the global standards, have a far greater ecological footprint than most of the world's people, but lower reproductive rates on the whole. We transfer blame for environmental destruction from ourselves onto people with higher reproductive rates, but much, much lower environmental footprints. In fact, what we find, by and large, is that those with the highest number of children are those with the smallest environmental footprints. In fact, a very interesting study by David Satterthwaite and others in India showed that the poorest tenth of the population there, who were generally those who had the largest number of children, had negative environmental footprints because they were, by and large, rubbish collectors who were recycling discarded material back into the economy and therefore effectively working in the environmentally negative part of the economy. And this is it's just a way of shifting guilt, shifting blame. I don't blame people for doing this because it's kind of human nature. We don't want to recognize our own impacts. But it's incredibly convenient, not least because there's almost nothing you can do about it. Which is another wonderful thing because it deprives us of agency. Oh, it's terrible, it's population. What are you going to do about it? Well, apart from killing all the doctors, which is one way forward, there's nothing you can do about it. There's nothing you can do about it. Oh, well, there is one thing, actually, because there are two components. There's birth rate and there's longevity. Any volunteers? Form an orderly queue afterwards. Oh, you put your hand up. Thank you. Very good. That's very good of you, madam.
You could have the next question for volunteering.
I work in public health and I interact with economists around the concept of human well-being. We might spend a lot of time debating what exactly that is, but it's probably a reasonably, electrically, probably most of us sign up to as a thing. Now, the economists have pretty much shown that it's unrelated to gross domestic product or economic growth. They've also shown that it's above a really quite a low level. It's unrelated to personal income or to consumption or to any of these things that are a real problem in terms of our relationship with the environment. And we know that it is positively supported by interaction with the natural environment, by the quality of relationships between human beings, and indeed in the nature of the distribution of resources and how equal that is. I don't see much of that argument being introduced into this area, because once you start really rubbishing the idea that economic growth is good for any of us, you do start changing the nature of the argument round a bit.
Well, we have to start from physical reality. That's where, I mean, everyone is always telling us, oh, it's not politically realistic. It's not economically realistic. You can't do this because it won't fly. And this is what, the young people on the climate strikes are constantly being told at the moment. And Extinction Rebellion people are constantly being told it's not realistic. And they say, okay, well, which realism are you setting as your baseline here? Political realism, yeah, okay, there is such a thing as political realism, but it can shift. What's politically realistic today could be might have been completely unrealistic 10 years ago. What seems completely unrealistic today might be realistic in 10 years. You never know. Things can shift very quickly indeed, especially in these volatile and vociferous times. Who would have guessed that Donald Trump would be president of the United States? Who would have guessed that Jeremy Corbyn would be leader of the Labour Party? Both of those propositions would have been dismissed as completely unrealistic, politically unrealistic, even 5 years ago, let alone 10. But physical reality, you can't bargain with that at all. The laws of thermodynamics don't change because you want them to. You can't suddenly decide that, oh, the atmosphere can take a bit more carbon and it'll be all right. Because it's not bargaining. It's not in the room doing a deal with you. It's not subject to political persuasion and debate and discussion. And what's the conclusion from that? The conclusion from that is that the physical realities have to become our political and economic baselines. That's what we have to work to and work from at all times. Now we can say, well, it might not fly with people to attack economic growth. You say, well, maybe at the moment it doesn't. Maybe people don't like the idea of stopping economic growth and moving to a different economic system. Well, of course they don't. We're all rather conservative, as I keep being reminded. And we tend to be afraid of change. But we can't persuade the atmosphere that it's okay to carry on with economic growth, because it's just going to spit that out straight back at us. We can't persuade the material world that it's okay to carry on with economic growth because it's going to spit us out with extreme prejudice. And we're already beginning to see what that means. So our task, I think, is this huge task, almost bigger than any generation has ever had to face. It's sort of almost a resetting of the moral compass. What we thought was morally good turns out to have huge implications that we weren't at all aware of. What we thought was philosophically sound turns out to have missed a crucial part of the picture. And so we almost have to start again, and we have to then bring other people along with us. That's the huge task. And that's where we have to change the political realities.
Man in the middle.
Thanks for the talk. Given the current climatic state of climatic crisis, and so the situation is deteriorating quite quickly, why do you think politicians are not listening to us and experts like yourself and sort of doing more to combat climate change? It doesn't seem to be, there can't really be a lack of information available, and indeed there doesn't seem to be a lack of activism. And what do you think we can do better or differently to sort of make them listen to us more?
Yeah. Well, it's a crucial question, the crucial political question, I suppose. And the fact is that we are not equally represented in politics. Politicians listen to those with the loudest voices. And those with the loudest voices tend not to be the people who are suffering from the impacts of environmental destruction because they can buy their way out. The great majority of the media is owned by billionaires. You have to be a billionaire to own it. And what billionaires want is radically different to what the climate strikers want. They want to carry on with things as they are. They want to carry on owning their fossil fuel reserves and flying in their private jets and gathering into their own pockets as much natural wealth as they possibly can. They want the opposite to what most people want. And they're the ones whose voices get heard. I mean, I'm working with the Labour Party at the moment on writing a report on the political economy of land. And even Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party is bloody terrified of the Daily Mail. Oh, we might not be able to say this because the Mail wouldn't like it. Shouldn't perhaps be saying this. But, you know, it's like, for God's sake, you know, why does Lord Rothermere, this blinking tax exile, have such a hold over our minds? Why have we allowed Rupert Murdoch to tell us what is and isn't permissible? Why do the weirdo Barclay brothers, why are they enabled to set the political limits of action? It's preposterous, but that's currently how it is. That's the current political reality which we have to change. And we have to change it by far more effective mobilization. I mean, the rich will always be with us. And the rich, well, you know, the powerful people will always be with us, whatever system we have, and they will try to hijack the system. And we always have to fight back and put them back in their box. You know, and even if we started with a position of total equality, some psychopathic people would try to grab more and elbow other people out of the way, and we had to put them back in their box. And at the moment, we are by and large a society of altruists governed by psychopaths. And it shouldn't carry on that way. Now, obviously, there's a huge range of political techniques we need to address that. Julia.
Thanks so much for being here. Two things on intergenerational theft. The first is a plea, an invitation for everyone to please actually come to the youth strike on March 15th. Last month, when the first strike happened in Oxford, George, you told the crowd, and you have no idea how much it meant to the young students. I was coordinating with them, and they told me after, you said it was the most inspiring climate action you'd ever been to. And so if that's motivation for everyone...
No, the most inspiring action I've ever been to. Great. Not just climate action, full stop action. Yeah,
there were over 1,000 people there, and as sort of the Oxford Uni person helping the school students, I can say that there were probably max 25 members of the university there. And that's not acceptable if people to show up for it on March 15th, 11 to 2, Bond Square near Westgate. Anyway, the second part is an actual question. And I'm thinking about sort of the university as an intergenerational institution, a sort of microcosm in a way. And I'm wondering how you think that universities have a responsibility to ensure that they are not perpetuating intergenerational theft. I'm thinking about in the way they teach, how they teach, potentially they invest in.
Thank you. No, thanks. And just to say about the youth climate strike, I mean, I cried. It was so inspiring and beautiful. It was just extraordinary. In fact, everyone was crying. It was quite remarkable. You know, I've got hardened neighbours who turned up because their children were on it, and they were tears streaming down their face. Quite an astonishing thing to see. And thank you. That's just amazing. Broadly speaking, Oxford University is a real estate conglomerate with some learning attached. These are extremely ruthless institutions. You know, as anyone who's lived in the city outside the university is aware, you know, they just crush any good thing and impose all sorts of bad things. And there's horrendous exploitation involved. We've seen how many universities have resisted divestment campaigns, which are urgently needed. You know, still investing in fossil fuels, all sorts of other redundant economies, and keeping them running. And we've also seen how I feel again and again universities fail their students by teaching them stuff which, you know, isn't actually current. I and others protested during my degree, which admittedly was sort of during the Jurassic, that there wasn't, we were talking about the living world all the time, that we didn't have a single environmental lecture scheduled. So eventually, after repeated protests, one of the ecology lecturers tried to give us an environmental lecture where he said, I mean, he knew nothing about it. It was quite extraordinary. He said, oh, the problem in the Amazon, look, these peasants all moving into it, I would machine gun them. We were just like, what? What are you talking about? And gradually I saw how, you know, when the pressure built up, the Environmental Change Unit was established, Institute was established, which was fantastic. But to begin with, all the lecturers they used came from the other academic disciplines and just were basically downloading their PhD thesis. And I thought, this isn't good enough. Isn't in any way good enough. And still, I feel, with a few glowing exceptions, we're not getting the systemic overview which is necessary. And boy, if it's bad there, what about in economics? What about in the Saïd Business School? It's just appalling, shocking dereliction of duty. Economics departments across the country are teaching their students bollocks, filling their heads with this neoliberal, neoclassical nonsense which bears almost no relation at all to how the real world works. Kate Raworth's critique of this is highly effective, and also that of the economic students who are trying to reform economics teaching. But again and again, I find in one subject after another that the students are being let down by those who are charged with teaching them about how the world works. And I think we need some radical reforms to the curriculums.
We've probably got time for two. Can we make the next two questions quick ones, and maybe we'll take them together, because we should be stopping. And are you prepared to bend your rule, because we have two women?
Okay.
Right, okay. There and there, yeah.
I'll try to be fast. So I'm on the course, a master's course called Nature, Society, and Environmental Governance. And effectively it's an interdisciplinary approach to environmental issues and kind of climate change. So I think that's kind of a really good start, because we're basically critiquing different disciplines. So I'd like to advocate that to undergrads. And then that kind of leads into rewilding, that you touched on earlier. So I'm kind of thinking about the concept of the commons that you've been trying to flesh out. And I was kind of thinking about how you think rewilding fits into this idea in light of things or examples like Neff Estate, where it's a form of rewilding, but it's also, and so it's kind of handing over to the commons, but it's still like a form of the privatisation of nature. And also arguments for rewilding that kind of revolve around tourism as a form of economic benefit. And then therefore that kind of leads into what I think has been exemplified by a lot of questions, is that there's like this change in mindset which perhaps I did an undergrad in human geography, and I feel like it's been extended into this course. It is this kind of understanding, like example of the question about nature and society and its binary, that needs to be really thought about, and that links into
It's becoming a very long question. Can you shorten it to a very short point? Because
I think that we can change people's mindsets to kind of better understand this relationship between nature and society.
Okay, hold that thought, and then the final question. Yeah.
Thanks so much for the talk. I'm also fortunate to be in the School of Geography, and we had Kate Greenwood as our lecturer. And yeah, it really revolutionised the way that I sort of saw economics, which I think was a really cool way. That's something that should definitely be introduced. My question is about resource flows and how the commons concept kind of fits into that in our globalized world, where you mentioned reducing consumption, and the consumption in richer areas often relies on the extraction of natural wealth in poorer places, and how that sort of fits into this concept of the commons globally, nationally, subnationally, and yeah, just.
Yeah, thank you. Well, neither of them are easy questions to answer. No, they're both very good ones. But so, I mean, it's true that, in countries like our own, our wealth, including much of the wealth of the university, is built on the colonial extraction of other people's wealth. And we're only just beginning to grasp the extent to which this is the case, that basically, the Industrial Revolution in England was based on the stolen wealth from elsewhere. And sure, there was massive exploitation within England as well, but it kicked off the more general sharing of wealth that some people at least enjoy today. But that is based on theft. It is fundamentally based on theft. And that, so we've got intergenerational theft, we've got interspecific theft, and we've got international theft as well, all taking place at the same time, which somewhat complicates the question even further. There isn't any easy answer, obviously, to any of these things, but I think they have to be considered as a whole. We have to recognize that they are interconnected, just as the other issues are that we're discussing. And so often we see emancipation in one part of the rich world turns out to be dependent on the continued enslavement of people in a part of the poor world. Again and again, we see this happening. We sort of see the resurgent working class in 19th century England, and we say, fantastic, people gained rights, and part of the reason they were able to do so was on the back of an industrialization which depended entirely on the exploitation and enslavement of millions of people around the world. And that's not in any way to diss those rights and the necessity to gain those rights, but it's to recognize that there was a payoff, and it was a devastating payoff. And if you would force me to say, was it worth it, I would find it really hard to answer that question. Just as I find it really hard to answer the question about the payoffs that we have today. On your question about the relationship between humans and nature, I mean, that's a very broad question, but I'll try to sort of stick with the sort of narrower formulation about the sort of aristocratic rewilding you discuss. And I think it's absolutely essential, actually, that rewilding is not just another tool for securing natural wealth. I much prefer the model, for instance, that Trees for Life has in Scotland, which is a sort of people's rewilding, where they bought land through public subscription, and they are then rewilding that land through public action, through mass volunteer tree planting and other stuff, which apparently I'm told is a lovely thing to do. Everyone who goes there goes again, because they really enjoy that. And there's that sort of sense that we do this as a shared project, I think, is essential. I don't think there's any justification for saying, I'm going to transform the nature of this land by myself as a major landowner. This is something that, like all the best things in life, we should do together.
On that note, please put your hands together.